George, what is your take on the announcement that's about 2 weeks old now that the ACC and ESPN re-upped their contract and extended?
Bummer, kind of a bummer. I can't lie. When you think about all the things to talk about again about FSU football, with with them kind of making that agreement and the rumors behind it, it kind of threw a wet blanket on the realignment talk. Now you got to wait on the courts, and who knows how long that's going to happen. My thing was like, how much does ESPN actually value keeping the conferences together? Because you know we talked about it. It was like two ACC games that were on primetime slots the entire year, 20 SEC games. So I think at the end of the day, it was more keeping Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, etc., under the ESPN umbrella. And the fact that they haven't left, and it seemed like maybe there's going to be a resolution. There's rumors out there that they'll have enough signatures now for the unequal revenue distribution, and maybe they can do something. FSU, Clemson, and the ACC come to agreement. I've seen people say maybe ESPN, they have them locked in for a few more years. Maybe they'll figure out a way to eventually move or FSU, Clemson, North Carolina over to the SEC, and that way it's still with ESPN. Somehow they work it out with the ATP. I don't know if any of that happens. To me, Florida State would still be best off in the Big Ten, but it's looking more and more like 2030, 2031 being your first chance out as these dominoes keep kind of falling. Unfortunately, I think I don't think that ESPN looked at the ACC and said, "Oh yeah, they're worth 2/3 of what the SEC and the Big Ten are to us right now." I think they looked at it and said, "We have this contract locked in through 2036. By 2036, we're going to be playing the Big Ten and the SEC $220 million a year." And at that time, 60-something million is going to be a deal for the ACC, especially if it's got FSU, Clemson, etc. in it. Especially if the latest rumor, or whether it's true or not, is that they're pretty close to agreeing to the 16 team playoff with 4 SEC, 4 Big Ten, 2 ACC, 2 Big 12, and 4 at large. All of a sudden, okay, well, if you're going to get 2 ACC teams in every year, that's not so bad for the FSU and Clemson of the world. But yeah, we'll see. It just, I was one of the people that really just scorned by ESPN, can't stand them, and by extension the ACC. When you find out how the whole thing came together, and it was all about Raycom and expense of the conference, and et cetera, it stinks. But it was an out there that was closed up. So just, I think I want to say March 27th, but that may not be right. Sometime next month will be the next hearing in the Florida State versus the ACC case in Florida. But it'll probably just get another one scheduled for 3 months down the road and on and on. We haven't heard anything of discovery at this point, and that's, I believe, we're getting that close to the deadline when that was supposed to get done. So we'll find out at that hearing.
So, George, back to the CFP AQs. I know you don't love the 2 versus the 4 that come out of the Big Ten and the SEC, but you're okay with that. See, I think that that's just utterly ridiculous that any conference, and of course the SEC and the Big Ten control this more and more, and they're leaning and pushing even more and more, and have gained more control of the sport than they ever have. But if you trust the process that you've got in play, you rank the teams, maybe you deal with the seedings and you go with that whole deal and look at conference championship weekend and what needs to change there. And you look at, again, the seeding process, the structure, the buys, all of that business. But if you trust a committee to select the right teams, then, hey, if the Big Ten is that good, if the SEC is that good in a particular year, they're going to earn the spots. This guaranteed spot business, I think, is horrible for college football.
Look, I think they've got so many names in the SEC and the Big Ten that if it went to 16, like we saw how heated they were about the SEC only having 3 this year, and they wanted one more. If you had 4 more spots, one
Sure.
or two of those SEC teams would have been there. I think it's just getting to the. They don't want any possible chance of it being less than 4. So it's like if we got to add 4 teams to make sure that happens, so be it. And that's where they're going with it. And they're to a guy like me who's just even more to what your opinion is, but I'll play devil's advocate. For somebody like me, they're like, oh no, this is terrible. But they're forcing me to be like, oh, if the ACC is getting 2 and the Big 12 is getting 2, you're, I mean, it's hard to argue that there's not half as many playoff teams in each
Sure.
one of those. So, but it's just, why do we need 16 teams just so you make sure you get 4? Because there's a chance there could be 3 teams in the ACC one year that could vie for it, and all of a sudden now you only get 2 SEC teams. That's what they saw coming, and we can't have that. But there was one part of it that I will say I took major offense to, and who knows if this will eventually be in it. But they were talking about for the SEC and the Big Ten, out of conference games don't count. It would just only be conference games that count. For your playoff chances. And that would force the SEC to go to 9 conference games, which I think would be great. Um, but they say it would make them schedule tougher out of conference games because then, there's no, if you lose, who cares? I'm going to say BS. You already, if you lose to number 3, that doesn't make a crap if you're in the SEC. That's not going to stop you if you do what you do in conference. That's nothing. That's water under a duck's bill. I mean, even Ohio State losing to Virginia Tech to start the year one year. There's been more recent examples where teams have lost early and went on to win a title. So I don't buy that one bit. That just means you just scrimmages, 2 scrimmages, and then the 2 or 3 scrimmages in the conference schedule. That apparently would include one Big Ten team and one SEC team, vice versa, for one of the out of conference games. I'm not sure if that would be counted as one of the games in the conference or not. But as far as all that, I think that's witchcraft and that should be stricken from the record. They shouldn't even consider that. That's like, at that point, it is just the Big Ten and the SEC's dance, and everybody else is, just kind of happy to show up. I think at that point, to your point, like, yeah, you can't have the inmates from the asylum, and that's the worst thing about this college football playoff because ESPN has it, and they run the ACC and the SEC kind of there. Now with the new deals coming up with the Big Ten, garnering so much power. At first, it's like great somebody to go up against the SEC, but when they join hands and run the empire by themselves, that's when things get a little sticky. And being honest, like if I had a ticket to the ride, I might not worry about it so much. If I knew FSU was going to be there next year, I might be all for it. But yeah, I guess that's where I stand. As a big fish in a small pond, 2 guaranteed playoff spots changes the math a lot because that's one of the things I talked about. Like, why would FSU want to be in a conference fighting 16 other schools for a spot when they could be an independent like Notre Dame, and lose a game or 2, no sweat, as long as you look like a playoff team at the end of the year. You don't get to say, oh, well, Syracuse has a better conference record and they've got 10 wins. You don't have that conversation about them and Notre Dame. It just doesn't. But if it was FSU in the ACC, that's what you get.
Well, Big Ten Commissioner Tony Petitti tipped his hand not long after he got the job. And I remember commenting on this at the time because what he said was contradictory on the surface. So he said, we need to, in the Big Ten, we need to schedule the most attractive games. We need to take our biggest brands and we need to play them against each other more often in late October and in November to maximize the entertainment value for the fans, the big brand matchups, and then obviously money. And then his second statement off of that was, but we're also going to make sure that we increase and maximize the number of playoff spots for the Big Ten. So my initial thought was, well, you're going to be hurting your best teams by playing them against each other more often, and that's going to hurt their chances because they're going to have worse records to make the playoff. But then, of course, it took me a few seconds to think, well, there's something working here that they're going to announce at some point, because they're not going to sabotage themselves by playing tougher games and having worse records and not making the playoff. And then voila, we have this. And then when you bring up the non-conference games between the SEC and the Big Ten, if we talk about getting to a place in the SEC and the Big Ten in particular where these non-conference games don't matter, aside from beating each other up, which is always a detriment to playing a difficult non-conference schedule, is you can get your team beat up to a certain extent. But beyond that, if we're going to play non-conference games and they're not going to matter much, and it's just all a TV show, and we just want the SEC and the Big Ten to play a bunch of games against each other, but we're not going to penalize the teams for losing the games, then I don't know where this sport is headed.
Yeah, because they're making it out like we're not going to penalize you for losing, so you got all the incentive to go out there and win. It's like, well, no, because you're not going to reward me for winning either. And like, what is it? Is it separate from the college football playoff poll now? They've got the FSU or the Big Ten SEC. Is it going to be like NASCAR? Where it's like the running thing. Oh, we got our 4 in here. Now we got the 4 Big Ten. Now the rest of the people, they can, they get the bottom 8 spots. Now we look at the polls to find out where the rest of the 8 spots come from. I don't know. Like, how do you not look at games when considering college football playoffs? I don't know how that would look. So I hope it doesn't make it. I hope it's just one of those things that dies on the cutting room floor that they're leaking out there to see what the fan reaction is. I hope it's negative, because it sounds crazy to me. It doesn't sound like college football.
Well, George, we appreciate you stopping by. Everybody stop by the Renegade Report. Spring practice is just about a month away for FSU football. So George and the crew is going to crank it up with a lot of recruiting news and spring practice talk. George, appreciate you stopping by. Good to see you, as always.
Absolutely, man. Hopefully there'll be more to talk about next time. Had a player get into a bit of trouble on the road. So hopefully he learns from it. Made the joke off air, but I don't know. Maybe it's a good thing. Nothing happened, obviously. There was no incident. But if, as many of these things as Georgia's had the past couple of years, maybe that means the program's heading in the right direction. Because this is the first incident, misdemeanor traffic incident that I've heard of at Florida State in a while. So maybe it's a good sign.